My name is Marissa Quinn, and I'm 18 years old. People think silence in a house means peace, but they're wrong. There's a kind of silence that isn't calm at all. It's hollow. It echoes in the walls and in your chest until you feel like you could scream and nobody would turn their head. That's the silence I grew up in. That was the diary entry I wrote 9 years ago, back when I still believed I could earn my place in this family. I am 27 now, and my name is Kelsey, but standing outside the heavy oak doors of the Sterling penthouse, that same hollow silence was screaming at me again. I wasn't here for a reunion. I had been summoned. My father's assistant had called it a mandatory family restructuring meeting. The phrase itself felt cold, metallic, and foreboding. I smoothed the front of my jacket, took a breath that tasted like stale air conditioning, and pushed the doors open. Drop a comment telling me, "Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home? I read every single story you share." The penthouse looked exactly as it had when I left, like a museum where nothing was allowed to be touched. My family was arranged in the living room like a tribunal. Richard, my father, sat in his high-backed leather chair. Catherine, my mother, was perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid. My siblings, Olivia and Connor, stood by the window, looking at their phones with identical expressions of bored superiority. They didn't stand up when I walked in. They didn't smile. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He cleared his throat and told me to sit. He said that we needed to talk about the Sterling brand. He said my lifestyle was becoming a liability. He called it a wandering lifestyle. He used the words travel vlogger with a sneer that made it sound like a disease. He said that Sterling hotels represented stability, heritage, and exclusivity, and my social media presence, my constant movement, my lack of a permanent address was damaging their reputation. He slid a stack of legal documents across the mahogany coffee table. It was a formal disownment. They were revoking my access to the family trust. They were removing me from the will. They were legally severing ties to protect the integrity of the estate. Then he held out his hand. He wanted the black card, the family credit card that was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of our status. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had raised me to believe that worth was determined by zip codes. And then I saw it. It was a tiny detail, something nobody else would have noticed. The cuffs of his custom shirt were fraying, just a little. A loose thread dangled near his expensive watch. I looked around the room. The fresh flowers that usually filled the vases were gone, replaced by high-end silk replicas. The air conditioning was set 2 degrees warmer than usual. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't about my reputation. This was about money. There is a specific kind of psychology to the falling aristocracy. When a wealthy family starts to lose their actual power, which is their money, they obsessively tighten their grip on their symbolic power, which is their status. They were bleeding cash. They were drowning. And instead of asking for help, they were cutting me loose. They were pruning the dead weight to keep their sinking balloon aloft for just a few more miles. They thought I was the heavy one. They thought I was the expense they could no longer afford. It was a fascinating illusion. The emptiness of their wallets had only amplified the arrogance of their egos. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't tell them they were wrong. I just reached into my purse, pulled out the black card, and dropped it onto the table. It made a sharp plastic click against the wood. Then I picked up the pen and signed the papers. The scratch of the ink was the only sound in the room. I signed away my inheritance. I signed away my name. I signed away the last thread of obligation to people who saw me as a budget line item to be deleted. I stood up. I looked at Olivia and Connor, who were smirking, thinking they had just secured a larger slice of the pie. They didn't realize the pie was made of ash. I walked out the door without saying goodbye. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping clean and final. I took the elevator down 40 floors. I walked past the doorman who had known me since I was a child. I stepped out onto the curb, but I didn't call a taxi. A black sedan with tinted windows was already waiting for me. The driver opened the door, and I slid into the cool leather interior. "Take me to the airfield," I said. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the secure app that managed my life. My family thought I was a travel vlogger, because that is what I let them see. They saw photos of me in Bali, in Tokyo, in Lisbon. They saw laptop lifestyle captions. What they didn't see was the code on the screen. They didn't see the contracts. They didn't see the empire. I am the founder of Nomad Nest. We are a decentralized hospitality network. We turned the entire concept of hotels upside down. While the Sterlings were polishing brass on the Titanic, I was building the lifeboats. We utilized prop tech to turn luxury properties into flexible, high-end workspaces for the new global economy. We didn't own buildings. We owned access. We owned the network. 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to the tarmac. My jet was waiting. It wasn't a charter. It was mine. I walked up the stairs and the flight attendant handed me a glass of water and a tablet. We were in the middle of closing our Series C funding round. I scrolled through the final figures. $400 million in new capital. The post-money valuation of my company was now $1.2 billion. I sat back in the seat as the engines roared to life. I looked down at the city, shrinking below me. Somewhere in that grid of lights, my father was probably drinking a scotch he couldn't afford, congratulating himself on cutting costs. Over the next 12 months, I watched them from a distance. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. I saw the headlines in the financial papers. Sterling Hotels misses quarterly earnings. Sterling Hotels seeks debt restructuring. I saw the cracks in the facade. My brother Connor crashed a leased Ferrari and tried to hush it up, but the dealership sued him for the payments. My sister Olivia, the vice president of brand image, started firing housekeeping staff to save money on payroll, sparking a public relations nightmare. The gap between their perception and reality was widening every single day. They were still acting like royalty, throwing galas and attending charity auctions, wearing borrowed jewelry and smiling for the cameras. But I knew the truth. I knew it because I was buying the data. I knew their occupancy rates were plummeting. I knew their lenders were getting nervous. I knew they were leveraging one property to pay the interest on another. It was a shell game, and they were running out of shells. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 14 months after I had walked out of the penthouse. My phone buzzed on my desk. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the tribunal. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Catherine," I said. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. Her voice was tight, clipped, and commanding. "Your father is ill," she said. "The stress is affecting his heart. We need to discuss the estate. Come to dinner on Saturday, the Flagship Hotel, 7 o'clock. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Even now, with their walls crumbling around them, they still thought they could command me. They still thought I was the wayward child who needed to be managed. "I'll be there," I said. I hung up. I didn't book a commercial flight. I told my pilot to prep the jet. I told my assistant to clear my schedule. And then I called my legal team. "Get me the file on the Sterling debt," I said. "All of it." I arrived in the city on Saturday afternoon. I didn't go to the penthouse. I went straight to the Flagship Sterling Hotel. As I walked through the lobby, the smell hit me. It was the smell of dust and desperation. The carpets were worn in the high-traffic areas. The fresh flowers were gone here, too. The staff looked tired and sparse. The grand chandelier had 3 bulbs burned out. It was subtle, but to a trained eye, it was screaming. This was a dying animal. I took the private elevator up to the owner's dining room. The family was already there. Richard looked gray and thin. His suit hung loosely on his frame. Catherine was wearing diamonds that I knew were insured for more than the cash they had in the bank. Olivia and Connor were drinking wine, looking agitated. "Sit down, Kelsey," Richard said. I sat. I didn't touch the napkin. I didn't reach for the water. I just waited. "We are in a difficult position," Richard said, staring at his plate. "The market has been unkind to traditional hospitality. We have a liquidity problem." He paused, waiting for me to gasp or to offer sympathy. I did neither. I just watched him. "We have found a solution," Catherine interjected, her voice shrill. "A bridge loan. A partnership." She gestured to the empty seat next to me. "Mr. Henderson is a very wealthy investor," she said. "He has agreed to inject capital into the Sterling collection. He is very interested in the family lineage. He is very interested in you, Kelsey." I blinked. The room seemed to tilt. "You want me to marry him?" I said. "It wasn't a question." "It is a strategic alliance," Richard said, slamming his hand on the table. "It is what is best for the family. You have been running around the world playing tourist. It is time you did something useful. He is willing to cover our short-term obligations in exchange for an introduction and a union. He is old-fashioned. He wants a wife from a good family. They weren't asking for help. They were selling me. They were trading me like a pawn to secure a loan. They still saw me as a resource to be exploited, an asset to be liquidated to save their skins." I looked at Connor. He was looking at the ceiling. I looked at Olivia. She was inspecting her manicure. They knew. They had all agreed to this. "Is that it?" I asked. "That is it," Richard said. "You will be charming. You will accept his proposal. You will save this legacy. I started to laugh. It was a cold, dry sound that bounced off the walls. I laughed because it was absurd. I laughed because they were so small. I laughed because they had no idea who was sitting at their table. I reached into my bag. I didn't pull out a compact or a tissue. I pulled out my tablet. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. The professional shift had happened. I was no longer the daughter. I was the shark. I swiped the screen and brought up the spreadsheet. Let's look at the numbers, I said, my voice dropping an octave. Sterling collection, total liabilities $120 million. Primary toxic assets, the downtown location, the beachfront resort, and this building. Debt service coverage ratio is below 0.6. You are in default on 3 major covenants. The room went silent. Richard's face went from gray to white. What are you doing? Connor asked. Put that away. I ignored him. The debt notes were bundled and sold 6 months ago, I continued. $120 million in distressed debt, due in full in 30 days. The primary creditor is a firm called Apex Capital. Catherine gasped. She knew the name. Everyone in the industry knew the name. Apex Capital was the vulture firm, the liquidator, the executioner. Apex is a partner, Richard stammered. We are negotiating with them. No, I said. Apex is not a partner. Apex is a liquidation firm. They don't want a partnership. They want the keys. Connor stood up, his face red. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a useless vlogger. You don't understand high finance. I didn't yell back. I just reached into my bag again. I pulled out a single document. It was thick, bound in blue paper. I slid it across the polished wood of the table. It stopped right in front of Richard. It was the deed to the penthouse we were sitting in. Apex Capital exercised the foreclosure clause on the penthouse note this morning, I said. You didn't receive the notification because I told the lawyers to hold it until I delivered it personally. Richard stared at the document. His hands were shaking so hard the silverware rattled against the china. How do you have this? He whispered. I leaned forward. Because I bought the note, Richard. I bought the debt on this building. I bought the debt on the hotels. I bought it all for pennies on the dollar through a shell company. I paused, letting the reality sink in. I am Apex Capital. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. They stared at me, but they didn't see the daughter they had discarded. They saw the monster they had created. They saw the checkbook that owned their lives. You, Olivia whispered. Me? I said. Richard looked like he was having a stroke. We did it for the family, he rasped. We disowned you to protect the legacy. We did what was best. I stood up. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. I thought about the letter I had written in my head 1,000 times. The letter to the girl I used to be. You pushed me to the edge, I said, not turning around. You pushed me out of the frame. You thought that by excluding me you were making me weak. But you didn't understand something fundamental about the edge. The edge is where you get the best view. I turned back to face them. While you were inside fighting over the tablecloths and polishing the brass on a sinking ship, I was outside building a new world. I was building the house. Being an outsider wasn't a punishment. It was a strategic advantage. It meant I didn't have to play by your outdated rules. It meant I could see the future while you were obsessing over the past. Richard slumped in his chair. Please, he said. Please, Kelsey, don't destroy us. I looked at them. They were small. They were broken. Destroying them would be easy. It would be trivial. And it would be boring. I don't want to destroy you, I said. I walked back to the table and tapped the tablet. I'm acquiring the Sterling collection. I'm merging it into Nomad Nest. We are going to rebrand every single property. The dusty velvet and the old rules are gone. We are turning them into tech-enabled flexible living hubs. You can't do that, Connor said weakly. It's our heritage. It's my asset, I corrected him. And I can do whatever I want with it. I slid a contract across the table. I'm offering you jobs, I said. Jobs, Catherine asked, hope flickering in her eyes. Executives. No, I said. I looked at Olivia. You care about image. You care about how things look. You will be the director of customer experience. You will manage the front desk protocols. You will deal with the complaints. You will serve the guests. I looked at Connor. You care about money. You will work in procurement. You will budget for soap and linens. You will learn the value of $1. I looked at Richard. You are retired, effective immediately. You will sign over your voting rights and you will vacate this penthouse by the end of the week. You can't be serious, Richard said. Those are the terms, I said. You sign and you keep a salary. You keep your health insurance. You keep a shred of dignity. You refuse and I foreclose on everything tomorrow morning. You will be bankrupt by noon. The pen lay in the center of the table. It was the heaviest thing in the room. Richard looked at Catherine. He looked at his children. He looked at the walls of the penthouse he had defined himself by. Then, with a trembling hand, he picked up the pen. He signed. Then he passed it to Catherine. Then Olivia. Then Connor. They signed their surrender. I took the contract. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just put it in my bag. I walked out of the room. I walked out of the hotel. I stepped into the cool night air. I didn't look back at the crumbling empire I had just acquired. I looked at my phone. My team was already launching the press release. The rebranding was live. I hadn't burned the house down. I had renovated it. There is a specific kind of justice in sowing seeds in the soil that tried to bury you. The best revenge isn't leaving your enemy with nothing. It is making them work for your vision. It is taking the legacy they tried to deny you and reshaping it in your own image. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from my apartment building. Welcome home. I unlocked my door with a digital key. I stepped inside. It was quiet. But this time it wasn't a hollow silence. It was peaceful. It was the silence of a structure that was sound, a foundation that was solid, and a life that was entirely, completely mine. If you've ever had to build your own table because they wouldn't give you a seat, share this story. You are the architect now.